It is the Banner Ravens podcast. Paul Mancano and Jonas Shaffer live on a Wednesday in late August. We got a big show for you today. We're going to go through our season predictions. We'll talk, of course, about the Ravens cutting down to their initial 53-man roster, and we'll preview the season ahead. But Jonas, we of course have to start with the sad news that came on Sunday, and that was the passing of offensive line coach Joe Dalessandris at age 70. Difficult news, and this is the second time in the last couple months that we're talking about an untimely passing. Of course, last time we talked about one in the Ravens family, it was Jacoby Jones, and the Ravens and John Harbaugh said that they're going to dedicate their season to both Joe Dalessandris and Jacoby Jones. It's just unfortunate that we get these two members of the Ravens family passing away within a short span of time here.
Yeah, it's been one passing after another. Frankly, if we're being honest, it's not just those two. It's been, you think of Tony Siragusa, you think of losing Alex Collins. Just, death comes for us all, and obviously it's a reality of life that people pass at whenever they're due, I guess. But it was pretty shocking, I guess, in the case of both Jacoby and Joe D, that they went the way that they did. Joe D looked like the picture of health, of vigor and vim and energy in training camp, and then to get the notification on the same day that Mark Andrews got into the car accident that he was stepping away from coaching to go into hospital care was definitely sad. And to wake up Sunday morning to the news that he passed away was definitely a shocker, and I guess just a reminder that we're only here on this earth for so long.
Yeah, he was experiencing complications from off-season surgery, but he was speaking with the media. I think it was mini camp. It was in the middle of the summer and giving his thoughts on the offensive line competition. And here we are, more than a week away from the start of the regular season, and he's gone. He was a great man by all accounts, from what we've heard from players, from coaches. And he was also darn good at his job. He was the OL coach since 2017, oversaw some of the best units in the NFL during that time. Last year, oversaw the 5th highest graded unit according to PFF. And you tweeted out a story that you had of him, just the kind of person that he was, interacting with members of the media and showing his generosity.
Yeah, I didn't really get the chance to know Joe D as well as some of the more veteran guys on the beat. Never had a sit down interview with him, but I was doing as my time at the Sun was wrapping up a couple years ago. I was doing a story on the Ravens security team, and it was around Christmas time, and just kind of waiting for people to get to where they're supposed to be, and you see Joe D in a hallway, with a box of Dunkin' Donuts, just passing them out to whoever was passing by with this, his great kind of impish smile, just kind of crystallized everything that Joe D was, which was like a kind man who was looking out for people, wanted to put a smile on their face. And you're obviously losing him as a teacher, but you're also losing him as a human being. And who he was as a human being was really, really special.
Yeah, and the Ravens will be feeling his loss all season long. And of course, he's going to be missed by so many. His daughters, certainly. He lost his wife in 2022 as well. So he is at least reunited with his late wife. And I'm sure that, they will feel his presence this entire season. All right, let's get to some football. And it was also a tough day yesterday for a lot of guys who didn't make NFL rosters. So around the league, it's tough whenever these guys are fighting for jobs. And the reality is it's fun to follow the roster machinations, but there is a human side. There is a reality to this, which is a lot of guys who have dreams of playing in the NFL, unfortunately don't get to realize them. But fortunately, they do have a practice squad, and some guys can bounce around. Some guys can stick around in various ways. So the Ravens cut down to their initial 53 yesterday. Jonas, you went 52 for 53 in prediction. So pretty much from your perspective, there were very, very few surprises. We came into camp with a couple battles along the offensive line, But other than that, there weren't a whole lot of jobs that were up for grabs.
No, it was just a lot of preseason crushes who I think people got, infatuated with. To see Dayton Wade not make the team, I'm sure was disappointing to some people. But then you look at, oh, there he is still available after the waiver claim period, and you realize, oh, I guess the Ravens thinking on him was pretty much aligned with the rest of the league. So good to see Bo Braid make the team. Local guy, Howard County to Maryland, should have been drafted, was not drafted. The Ravens potentially got a steal on him. Obviously, I think it's now 21 of the past 21 years where they've had an undrafted rookie make that initial 53-man roster. Maybe a little bit of a surprise to see Saleh make the team after a pretty disappointing preseason, not great training camp, but obviously, there is still some potential there with him. He can play guard, he can play tackle. So if you really messed it up, if you biffed it on your 53-man roster predictions, you have only yourself to blame, bud.
Well, the Ravens also kept 8 of their 9 draft picks. They had only one guy who didn't make the team. That was 6th round quarterback Devin Leary. He did not make the roster. The Ravens go with 2 quarterbacks, as we predicted, Lamar Jackson and Josh Johnson. And then at the running back position, we saw, unfortunately, Owen Wright, who had a nice little preseason, flashed a bit at times during camp. He's headed to the season-ending IR with a broken foot. So any thought that he would be returning, unfortunately, has been gone. And that final spot in the running back room was taken by the rookie Rasheen Ali.
Yeah, and I still think we overstate the importance of having a third running back on this team. I looked at what the Titans did last year with Derrick Henry on that team. And again, that was a team that didn't rely on a lot of quarterback-driven run stuff. So that workload is diluted even further. It was pretty much Derrick Henry, Tyjae Spears, almost identical snap count. We won't expect that in Baltimore, obviously, with Derrick Henry and Justice Hill, but their third running back had like 20 snaps all season. So if everything goes according to plan health-wise for the Ravens, then it's just, we're talking about a possibility where Rasheen Ali or whoever it is as that third running back. Obviously, Keaton Mitchell would change the calculus if he is back and fully healthy. But you're not talking about a huge need to go and really invest significantly in that RB3 position unless someone gets nicked up.
Yeah, and the important thing to note here is it is the initial 53-man roster. That doesn't mean it's going to be the roster that they go into week 1 with, or certainly not the roster that they're going to have the entire season. So you can make moves as the season goes along. I mean, Kenyon Drake was, bouncing in and out of the Ravens locker room at times last year. Dalvin Cook, who just got signed by the Cowboys, I believe. He is going to be, he spent time in Baltimore last year on the roster, not on the roster. So there are different moves you can make as the season goes along. And we've seen the Ravens use that third running back spot as a carousel in the past. Some other quick moves to discuss also. Arthur Mollett, he had that arthroscopic knee surgery. He's placed on IR, which means he can return as early as week 5. We knew he was going to miss sometime in September. And then Keaton Mitchell, who you just mentioned, is still on the physically unable to perform the PUP list as he rehabs from his torn ACL. And the practice squad news is going to be coming out in drips and drabs over these next couple hours, Jonas.
Yeah, looking like some guys we expected. It's pretty much all just getting the band back together on the practice squad where you are paid less money than you would be on the 53-man roster. Such as life. Devin Leary coming back, Dayton Wade coming back, CJ Ravenel coming back. I expect Kadarius Miles to be coming back. So pretty much the guys you saw in preseason, if they were good enough, if they were in that like upper 50th percentile of not good enough for the 53-man roster, should probably be making the practice squad. And, those guys, some of those guys, I should say, become important over the course of the season as guys get nicked up, as you need fill-ins on special teams, defense, offense. Obviously, the depth of this team, not exactly promising based on what we saw in preseason, but, it's a long season. You get the coaches, you get them in, get their strength up, you get their technique fine-tuned, and hopefully by the time that, certain guys are called upon, they're actually ready to contribute.
And we also did see a rule change within the last, 48 hours, which took even John Harbaugh by surprise. We spent all offseason talking about how, the Ravens will be totally fine going with two quarterbacks, especially because of the rule where quarterbacks could be elevated on game day and it wouldn't count against this certain limit that the rest of the players on the roster are subjected to, which is a limit to the number of times they can be game day elevations. That was really initially started because of the 49ers' weird playoff loss to the Eagles a couple years ago, where they were down to, ironically, Josh Johnson in that game coming in. And we saw that rule was nixed. So all of a sudden now quarterbacks are once again subjected to that same rule about game day elevations before they eventually are released or waived or added to the roster.
Yeah, I mean it's a players union issue. Obviously, they're going to be pro player. You like I said, are paid less if you're on the practice squad than you are if you are on the active 53 on the active roster. So they do not want any shenanigans going on. They don't want anything to set a precedent like this. Obviously, it's a bit of a surprise that we are just finding out now that I guess there was a misinterpretation of the rules. But hey, man, if that's not the age old battle between union between labor and management, then I don't know what is.
Yeah. I just love how it came right down to the wire, and it literally took the head coach of the Ravens, who is perhaps one of the most in tune coaches in the league in terms of what the league is doing and the machinations that happen behind the scenes, took him by surprise. All right, Jonas, let us dive into our season preview. Before we get into our predictions, we're going to ask some important questions that we still have for this Ravens team. Let's speed through the offseason for those who are just now catching up. Maybe you've been following the Orioles obsessively all summer, and now you're diving into the Ravens, trying to remember who they added, who they lost. There's a whole lot more names in the departures column than there is in the additions column. Let's get to the departures quickly. I'm going to read through these names as quickly as I possibly can because there are just so many. Mike Macdonald, defensive coordinator, perhaps the biggest one, goes to Seattle to become their head coach. Assistant head coach, defensive line coach Anthony Weaver gets the DC job in Miami. DB's coach Denard Wilson heads to the Tennessee Titans. On the player side, Patrick Queen, Jadeveon Clowney, Tyler Huntley, OBJ, Gus Edwards, J.K. Dobbins, Ronald Darby, Geno Stone, Morgan Moses, Kevin Zeitler, and John Simpson are all out the door. Jonas, boy, is that a long list.
It's kind of what we've been talking about for the past 5 months, right, Paul? I guess even further if you stretch it back to
we're just catching
when Mike Macdonald left.
It's great to put it all on one screen, though, and to really understand the gravity of their losses here.
Yeah, and I mentioned this in a story that should be coming out hopefully in the next couple of days. Just reasons for optimism for the 2024 Ravens and why they could win the Super Bowl. But you look at especially the defensive losses, and Mike Macdonald, of course, had a big hand in doing this. So did Anthony Weaver, so did Denard Wilson. But I think they had 13 Ravens who played at least 100 snaps last season, got at least a grade of 70 on PFF, which means that you are an above average contributor. The Steelers, who were a top 6 defense, the Browns, who were a top 2 defense, both had 9. The Bengals, who were terrible all year, had 4. So that gives you an idea of just how deep that defense was. And a lot of those guys that were 70 or above are now on other teams.
It's very odd to see all of these guys suddenly go out the door in one offseason. In terms of the most impactful, I still think it's Mike Macdonald. I still think it is the mastermind of that defense, which was one of, if not the best in the NFL last year, that held the eventual Super Bowl champions to just 17 points in the AFC Championship game. But you also saw brain drain seeing Anthony Weaver and Denard Wilson go. Patrick Queen, we figured coming into the offseason that he was not going to be long for this team. Jadeveon Clowney was going to be a free agent no matter what after the year, but nobody expected him to be as impactful on that defense last year as he was. Other than Mike Macdonald, is there one name, Jonas, that sticks out to you the most as most impactful? I think perhaps one that goes underrated is also Morgan Moses, who the Ravens traded to the Jets.
For me, I would probably go with Jadeveon Clowney. Just we're going to talk about the pass rush, but for him to have the career season that he did, for him to be as durable as he was after the kind of snake bitten career that he's had so far, He was an ass kicker in the run game, great guy in the locker room. To lose him, obviously it would have cost a pretty penny to bring him back. But considering just what this pass rush could have been with Jadeveon Clowney, with a leveled up Odafe Owe, with Madubuike and Travis Jones in the middle, that would have been, you probably lock that in as on paper the best defense in the league. And a lot of questions with his absence, not just in the pass rush, but can you be as consistent setting the edge if it's David Ajabo, if it's Adisa Isaac, if it's these young guys who don't have that, dog mentality of a Jadeveon Clowney.
So what did the Ravens do to replace all of these guys that left their building? Well, they promoted Zach Orr to defensive coordinator to take over for Mike McDonald. He was the inside linebackers coach last year, of course, oversaw Patrick Queen and Roquan Smith on a position coach level. In terms of finding a new offensive line coach after the passing of Joe D'Alessandris, George Warhop, who was the Texans offensive line coach in 2022, gets that job. Defensive line coach Dennis Johnson, who is an assistant at Baylor, comes in. Mark DeLeon, who is an analyst at Kansas, is the inside linebackers coach replacing Zach Orr. Secondary coach is it Mallory from Michigan, comes in. And then on the player acquisition side, the biggest name by far is running back Derrick Henry, who signed a 2-year deal in Baltimore. They brought back Arthur Millette as a cornerback. They brought back Kyle Van Noy, the veteran on the edge. They signed Eddie Jackson, the veteran safety from Chicago. They added Deontay Hardy, who was on Buffalo Bills last year, as wide receiver, punt returner, kick returner. And they signed Josh Jones from Houston. So a lot shorter list. Who is the most impactful? I think it has to start with Derrick Henry.
Yeah, I think Derrick Henry, I guess if you want to twist the semantics of it, you could say maybe keeping Ronnie Stanley instead of cutting him, addition by not really doing anything but restructuring that deal. He's looked good in camp. I know we've heard that before. I know that list of injuries makes him a bit of a ticking time bomb, but considering just the state of this offensive line, it's kind of scary to imagine what it could have been if Ronnie Stanley were not on this roster. And I mean, it's possible that we're talking in a week's time. Oh, Ronnie Stanley got hurt again. What the hell are they going to do at left tackle? But for now, being the optimist that I am, I at least feel comfortable with Ronnie Stanley at left tackle. And I think not making a move on him, besides trimming that contract back a year, I think could be hugely consequential down the line.
And the Ravens came into the offseason with some of the least amount of cap space of any team in the NFL, but they also could have opted for some contract restructures. They didn't. They ended up keeping a lot of contracts the same and keeping their cap space tight in order to not guarantee more money and not kick the can down the road. In terms of the draft, they drafted 9 guys, as mentioned, started with Nate Wiggins, Roger Rosengarten, the offensive tackle, Adisa Isaac, the edge out of Penn State on day 2, and then Devontae Walker, TJ Tampa, Rasheen Ali, Devin Leary, Nick Samak, and Sanusi Kane. They ended up keeping 8 of those 9 drafted guys.
Yeah, and they've made a good bit of wise choices, I think, in the draft the last couple of years. Obviously, you're going to have to keep this thing rolling, because you look at teams that have been set up with franchise quarterbacks and veteran talent, and just how expensive it gets to maintain all that. You got to hit on those draft picks. You look at the Chiefs; they were maybe headed toward a bit of a not quite good enough situation with Patrick Mahomes, and then they killed one draft class, they killed another, and now they are obviously the Super Bowl favorite, coming off 2 Super Bowl championships in a row. So it's still TBD on whether this class could generate the kind of starting level talent that you need to keep this thing rolling. But for them to lose just one draft pick from this year and one draft pick from last year, that was Kaiu Blue Kelly, have everyone from those 2 draft classes be on the 53-man roster. It's at least a sign, I think, of good process overall for Eric DaCosta and that Ravens front office.
Yeah. Now, before we get into our predictions for the season, Jonas, we still have questions that have not been answered about this team, and we're going to debate some of these. Let's start with the offensive line, because that was the most scrutinized position all offseason and all training camp. My question for you: will the Ravens' inexperienced offensive line derail their season? They're replacing 3 starters along the offensive line. It's pretty much unprecedented that a team that was just in the AFC Championship game, a team that is not rebuilding, has to replace 3 guys along the front. They had new offensive line coach George Warhop now overseeing that unit. It's going to be a huge inflection point for this team as to whether the 3 new starters, who John Harbaugh did not name, by the way, the other day. He said there was no real competitive advantage to him naming the winners of the offensive line battles before their game against Kansas City. If those guys perform even close to the level that we saw from the group last year.
Let's talk about them player by player, who we think it's going to
Sure.
be. And then I want to ask you an addendum question to that. Left tackle, Ronnie Stanley.
Ronnie Stanley.
We just talked about him. We know who he is. Do you feel better about him or the Orioles bullpen?
Yeesh. I mean, I still feel better about Ronnie Stanley right now because he's healthy and he's far less washed than another guy in the Orioles bullpen who is approaching a career saves record.
Left guard, we think it's going to be Andrew Voorhees. Obviously, he was the early favorite in training camp. Did not have a great preseason. I think PFF graded him as the lowest rated Ravens offensive lineman. Obviously, a bit of a sliding scale there because he is the one going up against the first, second stringers that were starting these games, but gave up a sack, didn't really move people in the run game. Feel better about him as your starting left guard or the Orioles bullpen?
Or the Orioles bullpen? I feel better about Voorhees still. I think that the Ravens feel good about the guy that they were able to grab in the 7th round.
They also felt
year.
good about Saleh in the training camp last year, Paul.
That's true. That is true. He didn't look good in the preseason, though, and I think Voorhees has looked just fine at guard.
Center, obviously the surest thing. Tyler Linderbaum, good to see him back at practice on Monday. Red non-contact jersey, but all indications are that he should be good to go for week 1. They obviously need him. I think we both feel better about potential All-Pro Tyler Linderbaum than we do about the Orioles bullpen, assuming that he is able to make it through this season healthy. Right guard, Daniel Faalele. Still a bit of a weird fit. You rarely see tackles his size, like 6'8", 360, 370. For them to move inside to guard is just totally bizarre. Did pretty well as a pass protector. Still not really sure about his run blocking fit. We can talk about that a little bit later. Do you feel better about big Daniel Faalele and now entering year 3 in Baltimore or the Orioles bullpen?
We really should have made player comparisons here, because if I had to make a comparison for Faalele, I'd probably say Sir Anthony Dominguez in the Orioles bullpen, because it's somebody who is being used in a role that they probably shouldn't be used in. And Sir Anthony Dominguez is now the de facto Orioles closer because, there have been so many other options that have not worked there. That's kind of how I feel about Daniel Faalele. I really worry about him moving in space. I worry about him holding up in the run game. I have my concerns. I think that when he can get guys directly in front of him and he doesn't have to move side to side, he'll be okay. And I also worry about him playing a lot of snaps. He is going to be physically taxed out there. So I have my concerns. Probably of all the 5 guys on the offensive line, most of my concerns go to Daniel Faalele at right guard.
So equal levels of consternation is what I'm sensing from you.
Yeah, probably maybe more Faalele, honestly.
And then right tackle, still a little bit of a coin flip between Pat McCarry and Roger Rosengarten. Obviously, Roger Rosengarten got the start in the final 2 preseason games, did a pretty good job, especially in pass protection. Run blocking still coming along. I still think his rookie year deficiencies as a people mover are probably going to be what hold him back from potentially being like a well above average player this year. McCarry didn't play at all in week 3, which is usually the kind of treatment that is afforded to week 1 starters. John Harbaugh left open the possibility that we could get some rotations there at right tackle, which I'm sure would delight every Ravens fan. Just to get a flashback to what we saw last year with right tackle and left tackle. How are you feeling about Roger Rosengarten versus the Orioles bullpen?
I'm going to make a comparison to an Orioles starter. So I'm going to change the parameters here, and I'm going to compare him to Cade Povich, because We've seen some good stuff from rookie Cade Povich in his first big league season. We've also seen some bad stuff. The Orioles have a lot invested in the guy. They hope they can have a future starter in him. But right now he's being pressed into action perhaps earlier than they would like. He's starting a lot of important games down the stretch because of injuries. I think that's kind of how Roger Rosengarten is going to be used this year. He's going to probably, if he is going to be named the starter, be thrown into Arrowhead week 1 against the Kansas City Chiefs. That is just a difficult spot to start your NFL career. As high hopes that the Ravens have for him, he may not start his NFL career on fire going up against some of the toughest teams in the NFL, 4 tough opponents in the first 5 weeks. So I feel good about Rosengarten, over the long haul. I still think he can be a franchise right tackle potentially. It just may not be right away.
Yeah, it's a nice transition that you mentioned the Chiefs because I think obviously when you think about what went wrong in that AFC Championship game, a lot of people are still hung up on the abandonment of that run game. And I went back recently, Paul. We're going to talk about this, I'm sure, in about a week's time when we preview Week 1. But maybe the hottest take from that game was that actually Todd Monken was right to abandon the run game because in those few carries that he did get, there were dudes just getting tossed out the club. I mean, Tyler Linderbaum ending up on his butt, every other play. Kevin Zeitler ending up on his butt every other play. The longest, I think, play from scrimmage that they had was, an unbalanced run where the Chiefs defensive line wasn't even set, where, Lamar Jackson takes it on the QB keeper or the design QB run and goes for like 15, 16 yards, whatever it was. I don't know, Paul, if what we see week 1 is going to be any better in terms of like giving guys a chance to actually get upfield. With this run blocking unit, I just have concerns about like how they all fit together, honestly. Like John Simpson could be a good mover in space. Kevin Zeitler was more of a smash mouth strength guy, but he could at least kind of turn the corner. Morgan Moses, strong, moved well in space. And now we know that Roger Rosengarten can move, but he doesn't have Morgan Moses' strength. Maybe it'll be comparable considering Morgan Moses was kind of playing through that torn pec and he didn't have the natural, heft that he didn't have that flexion that you need. But Daniel Lele is not a great mover. Can you trust him to do any kind of pulls? Can you trust him to do any kind of zone blocking where you're just kind of, running laterally to try to scoop that defensive lineman that you're going up against? Andrew Voorhees is probably comparable in movement to Kevin Zeitler, but still not a great natural mover. We know Tyler Linderbaum can make every kind of block. We know Ronnie Stanley has good feet, maybe doesn't have the kind of strength that he used to because of the knee and ankle injuries and how they've kind of sapped his strength. So I just have no clue really how this kind of weird mishmash of body types and some guys who move well and some guys who don't and some guys who are strong and some guys who are just don't have that kind of lift off the line of scrimmage. What is that going to mean for this run game? Like, are there certain parts of the Todd Monken running playbook, which is really in a lot of respects, the Greg Roman running playbook, are just going to be off limits because they know that defenses won't respect, Daniel Faalele pulling into space or, I don't know, Ronnie Stanley kind of executing a duo block because he just can't, dislocate an opposing defensive lineman. Is this going to be a group that can do everything? Or is it going to be a group that tries to do everything but does nothing especially well? And it's just really tough to answer because we haven't seen Lamar. We didn't see Lamar in there in the preseason. We don't know how much respect or disrespect defenses are going to give Derrick Henry when he's in there next to Lamar. I just think that, the kind of era of good feeling with this Ravens running game reliably being top 5 could be for a bit of a rude awakening if Lamar just doesn't go supernova as a runner.
Yeah, and one thing I can almost guarantee is that we're going to see a lot of Patrick McCary, even if he doesn't win that. And we're assuming he's probably not going to win that right tackle competition with Roger Rosengarten because he is their super utility player. To make another baseball reference, he can back up any of the 5 offensive line spots, and anytime somebody goes down or if guys struggle, Patrick McCarry's going to be the first call. But what happens if you lose two guys, or two guys struggle, or one goes down with injury and another guy struggles? Their depth is going to be tested. Ben Cleveland is probably going to have to play some serious snaps this season again. And where he is used, whether it's backup center, whether it's guard, as John Harbaugh said, maybe he's a center. We just don't know. So this offensive line group is going to look potentially very different in week one than they will look at the end of the season. And you just hope that they can just band-aid the group in front of them now, develop the guys that they're still developing, and get to the point where they're in the playoffs at the end of the season and that unit feels a lot more comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely going to be some growing pains. For as bad as we feel about the run blocking, I think there should be some confidence in the pass blocking. Linderbaum was great last year. Ronnie Stanley was really, really excellent toward the end of last year. Rosengarten has the feet to mirror guys in space. Fa'alele, I think just by virtue of him being a big guy, is just straight up tough to get around, especially when you put him in that kind of phone booth. But man, I mean, you look at the first 5 weeks on this roster, and there are so many tests, every single week. Week 1, you got the Chiefs. They finished behind the Ravens in sacks last year. They've got Chris Jones, who can line up anywhere. Steve Spagnuolo is, a mad scientist who can send blitzers from every level, which is going to be really tough for the offensive line to pick up. Week 2, you got the Raiders. Max Crosby is an all-pro. Christian Wilkins is like a really, really good interior rusher. Got 9 sacks last year from Miami. $110 million deal from Las Vegas, so obviously expecting big things from him. Week 3, Cowboys, defensive line depth maybe isn't as great as it once was, but they still have Micah Parsons, total athletic freak, can juke you out of your socks, as a guard. If you're a guard, can run around you. If you're a left tackle, right tackle, he's going to be a headache. Week 4, the Bills were 4th in the NFL in sacks last year. Lost Leonard Floyd, but they bring back 4 guys who all had 6+ sacks last year. Daquan Jones probably would have been among them if he hadn't gotten hurt. Another really strong interior presence there. And then week 5, the Bengals, you don't really worry too much about the diversity of options there. But Trey Hendrickson, still a great player, almost 40 sacks over the past 3 seasons. He's probably going to be a Ronnie Stanley problem, assuming that Ronnie is still going, because he just exclusively lines up over the left tackle. But that's one hell of an opening stretch that is going to be kind of, I think, force this offensive line into sink or swim territory in some respects.
And the Ravens invested heavily in a free agent running back in the hopes that he could overcome the offensive line in front of him, Derrick Henry. And the question I have next for you, Jonas, is will Derrick Henry be worth the investment? They signed the guy to be a game changer, and they could have used some of the money that they spent on his 2-year, $16 million contract potentially on offensive line depth. They traded Morgan Moses in order to get a little bit of cap relief there. They could have used some of that money to bolster the offensive line, maybe make a stronger push to re-sign Kevin Zeitler, who ended up signing with Detroit. Derrick Henry is turning 31 in January, and I know that sounds like a very high age for a running back. There aren't a whole lot of running backs who have had success in their age 30 seasons in the modern NFL. But there's only one running back like Derrick Henry in the modern NFL, and maybe in the last 50 years. Derrick Henry is a unique force, and he brings something so special to this offense that the Ravens have not had in a long time, and he is a unique game changer back there. Will he be worth the 2-year, $16 million contract that could really be a 1-year contract, and they can get out of it with just $4 million of dead cap in 2025? Will he be the kind of force multiplier, to use one of John Harbaugh's terms, that they signed him to be?
I think it really comes down to Lamar, and it comes down to that offensive line. I mean, I don't think there's a better summation of the kind of shit sandwich that Derrick Henry was eating last year than the fact that he was PFF's number 3 rated running back in all of the sport, and he finished with a career low, or tied a career low, in yards per carry. I think it was 4.2. So if he is going to a marginally better offensive line in Baltimore, then you're not going to get as much juice from that squeeze as you want. I mean, I think going back to the offensive line in general, like, I don't know if there's a offensive line in the league that is relying more on its quarterback than the Ravens are on Lamar Jackson. Like he's going to be the guy who, by virtue of how well he can break the pocket, is probably going to keep those edge rushers from just rushing upfield every time. And he's also going to have to be a guy who, with his ability in the read option game, gives Derrick Henry the kind of favorable box counts, body counts that he didn't really enjoy in Tennessee. And so the comparison that I have for Derrick Henry is like, you don't want this to be like pairing a vintage Bordeaux with a box of Kraft mac and cheese. Like, yeah, that's a suitable dinner, but you want that shit to be premium. Excuse my language. You know what I mean?
That's a
Like you
that's a
want
girl dinner.
you want this to be a fine you want this to be fine dining. That's what you bring Derrick Henry in for. And I guess should we keep the wine comparison going by saying that we know he's a well-aged running back? Not a lot of examples of running backs doing the kind of stuff that gets you $8 million a year at age 30. It's just the reality of the game. I think PFF did an analysis a couple of years ago that found that like most running backs tend to plateau after 1,500 career carries, and Derrick Henry hit that 2 years ago. That is kind of what we're dealing with. He is built different. We're a built different podcast, but at a certain point, that age cliff comes for every single running back in the NFL.
Yeah, and in the interim, in those last 2 years, he racked up a whole lot more carries and has led the league in carries a lot over the course of his career. He just has a unique workload for a running back. The Ravens also chose to invest a little bit less in their wide receivers. They did not bring back OBJ, who signed with Miami. That's 500 plus yards from last year out the door. They drafted Devontae Walker out of UNC with a 4th round pick. He had just 1 catch in the preseason, and they re-signed Rashad Bateman after he had 367 yards last year. Jonas, will the Ravens regret not investing more resources into the wide receiver room?
I think it probably depends on just what they can get out of their tight ends and how those guys fit together. I know that's kind of a cop-out answer, but if everyone is clamoring for 12 personnel, 12 personnel, 12 personnel, or 13 personnel or 21 personnel with Pat Ricard being on the field instead of an Andrews or a Likely or a Kohler, then that reduces your dependency on 3 receiver sets, 4 receiver sets. I'm still a little bit uncertain about how committed Todd Monken is to 12 personnel sets with Andrews and Likely on the field together. I feel like if he doesn't think that this offensive line is good enough as a run blocking unit, then what benefit do you get out of putting Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely on the field together? You know what I mean? Like if you are saying your defense doesn't have to worry about getting run over, then these defenses are just going to match Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely with, kind of like body types. They're not going to be covered by linebackers. They're going to be covered by safeties. And I think that would have a potentially, negative effect on what this Ravens passing offense wants to do. And none of those guys is really a tremendous force multiplier as a blocker either. So I like what the tight ends can do. Don't know how they can do it together. And obviously the Rashad Bateman situation is what it is. We're going to have to see it before we'll believe it. And also I'm not really sure what to expect out of Zay Flowers this year, Paul. Like he didn't have a great training camp as a rookie, goes out and breaks, a bunch of Ravens rookie receiving records. I thought he would level up in training camp this year, but he didn't really do a whole lot. Like there weren't practices where he just took over or he was running by dudes. Maybe that's just a reflection of the simple fact that the Ravens had a really, really good cornerback room, and every one of those guys is, plus starter level cornerback. But nothing Zay did in training camp left me to believe that like he's going to be a kind of guy that we're all talking about as a consensus wide receiver 1 after this season. Maybe I'll be wrong. Maybe it's just, him trying stuff in training camp and knowing that once the regular season kicks off, he'll be on the same page with Lamar. He'll be running by guys. He'll be kind of recapturing that old college form where he was such a dynamic downfield threat. But I'm a little bit uneasy about calling him like the alpha on this receiving core. And frankly, like I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's probably only like a 10% chance, but it wouldn't shock me. And I know this might sound shocking that if like Rashad Bateman if he's healthy, gets more receiving yards than Zay this year.
Fascinating way. It's almost similar to the Derrick Henry conversation because not many teams can boast a 6'2", 250-pound running back, and they're expecting him to be above the norm in terms of what running backs can do in their age 30 season. But at the same time, not many teams have a wide receiver one who is 5'9", 175. That is not a typical body for somebody who's going to lead your team in receiving yards. But we've seen smaller guys have great seasons. Tyreek Hill's not a big guy, but he is an especially quick burner. And
And he's
whether Zay
jacked too.
Flowers, yeah, and he's jacked. Whether Zay Flowers can kind of overcome his physical profile to become a 1,000-yard receiver, it's certainly possible. He had over 850 yards last year. It's just whether he can take on that much of load from the offense. On the defensive side, Jonas, we saw a defensive side of the ball that is losing a lot of players, losing a lot of difference makers, and losing their head man. Mike Macdonald, of course, going to Seattle. Now Zach Orr steps in, 32 years old, former player. We saw when Mike Macdonald first got the job in Baltimore 2 seasons ago, it was a rough start. He had a 40-burger hung on him by Miami in that ugly game in week 2. The first 8 weeks were not great, and then he flipped a switch in the second half of that season. Part of that was due to the addition of Roquan Smith, but it wasn't an awesome start to Mike Macdonald's tenure as defensive coordinator in Baltimore. Will Zach Orr go through the same kind of growing pains that Mike Macdonald did in his first crack at a defensive coordinator job?
Yeah, I mean, we mentioned just a couple minutes ago the pass rushers in that opening stretch for the Ravens. You look at what the defense could be going up against. Chiefs week 1, Sheil Kapadia for the Ringer had them as his 7th best offense in 2024. I think you could make an argument to that, like with Mahomes, that offensive line, the wide receiver speed, they could easily be first. The Raiders, obviously, we're not expecting them to be anything special. Sheil had them 30th. Cowboys 12th, but Dak Prescott is a awesome quarterback. Probably would have won the MVP if he'd finished that season stronger last year. Buffalo Bills, Josh Allen, 9th, could also be a high upside play just with, some of the receivers they have, the offensive line stability, the running game. And then the Bengals at week 5, Sheil had them 6th. So when you look at that group, to me, it is like the pain box from Dune. Paul Atreides, not you, Paul, the other Paul, holding his hand in that box, seeing how much he can withstand. And you don't want to abandon your principles as a coordinator. You don't want to abandon your principles as a leader. And I think that if he can make it through that first month plus of the season, with us feeling okay and the Ravens feeling okay and John Harbaugh feeling okay, then the rest of the season should feel like a breeze. But that is one hell of a amount of pain to kind of go through if there's any kind of uncertainty or lag or whatever that could be keeping this defense from recapturing the awesome form that it was in last year.
And it'll also be a question of how long it takes Zach Orr to develop the voice from Dune that he can use to command other people.
Do you think Zach Orr knows what the Gom Jabbar is? Which I didn't. That's the little handheld needle that's the needle that they held to Paul Atreides' neck in the movie.
Gotcha.
If he took the hand out,
would he have been killed if he took his hand out early from that pain box?
That was my implication. I never read any of the Dune books. I'm not a nerd. I just watched all 22 film.
All right, one more question for this group, Jonas, before we get into our predictions. We talked about the losses along the defensive line that the Ravens had, their losses in the pass rush. Will the Ravens pass rush come close to last year's, leading the NFL in sacks? Last year, of course, led by Justin Madubuike. He's still back. He's on a $98 million contract. They expect him to be a difference maker up the middle. But on the edge, there was a little bit of attrition. They lost Jadeveon Clowney to Carolina. Kyle Van Noy, they brought back, but he's another year older. They are expecting a big jump from Odafe Owe, whose 5th-year option they just exercised for the 2025 season. Can they get even close to their 60 sack mark from last year?
It's pretty unlikely. I think we talked about this, Paul. Only last year, the Eagles went from being in 2022, far and away the NFL's sack leaders to a kind of mediocre unit. And that was with not a lot of turnover in those ranks. Obviously, losing Jonathan Gannon, I think probably had a little bit of a negative effect. But um, you're not just losing Jadeveon Clowney, you're not just losing Mike McDonald, but you know how many opportunities are you losing to just pin your ears back and get after guys because it's the third or the fourth quarter, and instead of leading by 14, you're up by 3 or you're down by 7, and so much of sack productivity just comes down to opportunity. The Ravens were not the NFL's best team in terms of generating pressure. I think they were like seventh or something in pressure rate, but they finished with so many sacks because, frankly, they faced a lot of really, really bad quarterbacks, but also because they just put themselves in situations where, like I said, they could say, go get this guy. You don't have to worry about the run. Just do what you got to do to bring this guy down. And they did that time and time again. And it's really hard to imagine this team getting anywhere close to 60 sacks unless we see tremendous strides from Odafe Oweh, unless Zach Orr is the real deal, unless you can get kind of piecemeal contributions from Adisa Isaac, Tavius Robinson, David Ajabo, maybe Kyle Van Noy gives you 5, 6, 7 sacks. It's really hard for me to see him at age 33 kind of recapturing last year's form, but it's going to be a big issue. Maybe the secondary is just good enough to give these guys like the extra half second they need to get home, but 60 sacks is a lot, man.
It doesn't mean that they can't still be a great defense, though, if they don't get close to that 60 sack mark, because they invested in that secondary, adding Nate Wiggins, TJ Tampa in the draft. They're hoping for a healthier season, more productive season for Marlon Humphrey. So maybe they'll grab more interceptions. I know they led the NFL in turnovers last year, but could be an improved unit in the secondary. So they could still be an elite defense, even though it is hard to see them getting close to 60 sacks this year. All right, Jonas, we're going to dive into our predictions. You're breaking news while you're literally on the podcast. I saw you tweet that tight end Quadir Ishmael is coming back on the Ravens practice squad. We also saw the Steelers announce their starting quarterback for week 1. A division opponent is going with Russell Wilson. That's got to feel good for the Ravens. Really, whoever is going to win that competition, you feel good about if you're an opponent. All right, Jonas, let's dive into our predictions now. Let's talk about what we think this Ravens team could do if they could repeat as the number 1 seed, as the AFC North champions, and get back to the AFC Championship game or even the Super Bowl. I predicted when we came out with the schedule predictions that they would be a 10-17 because I looked at how difficult that schedule was, and I thought it was going to be awfully difficult for them to get to the bye with too many games over 500. That is going to be the toughest test. It's that first 5-week stretch of the season, as you mentioned. Looking back at it, I'm going to bump my prediction up by 1 win. I'm going to go with an 11-6 regular season record. It's a first place schedule. It's awfully difficult. And when you look at that schedule, you can't see too many quote unquote easy wins, where you would consider it maybe a greater than 75% chance of winning that game. You look at maybe at home against Las Vegas in week 2, but we've already seen what Gardner Minshew can do at M&T Bank Stadium in week 2 of a regular season game. You look at home against the Washington Commanders, home against the Denver Broncos, probably at the Giants near the end of the season would be close to easy win. But other than that, it's just hard to see a lot of games where you can chalk a W up for the Ravens already.
Yeah, I'm going with 11-6 also. It was awfully tempting to pick 12, 13 wins, but then, you remember the offensive line. You think about the potential downgrade from Mike McDonald to Zach Orr. That teams as generationally good as the Ravens were in the regular season last year do not just fall off trees. They just don't fall out of the coconut tree. It's really, really tough to have a team as good as that. And, there is natural regression in this world. And I think the Ravens will probably experience that. Obviously, the big, variable in all this, the big potential wrinkle is just the Lamar Jackson health factor. Hopefully he stays healthy. You don't want this lighter frame that he's going to be playing on to make him more exposed to hits. I'm hopeful that it won't. But on the scheduling bit, I actually feel like maybe a little bit more bullish about how it helps the Ravens than you, Paul. It's kind of interesting to see, just where the odds makers and the analysts have this schedule lining up. I think, Sharp Football Analysis had the Ravens with like the fifth toughest schedule in the NFL. But then you look at FTN and Aaron Schatz and what they do. I think they had it as like only the 21st hardest schedule. For me, I think a lot of that probably comes down to there aren't a lot of great or at least sure thing quarterbacks on this on the schedule. Like even Cincinnati with Joe Burrow, do you really trust him to make it through this season fully healthy with him coming back from that kind of unprecedented right wrist injury? There's just a lot of trash, frankly, that's like on the Ravens schedule at that quarterback position, and I think you should feel somewhat optimistic about that if you're looking for reasons to be optimistic about how the season could end up going the right way for the Ravens.
Yeah, and the Ravens had a second place schedule last year that ended up kind of playing like a first half schedule that was in the inverse. It got very difficult near the end of the season. Going at San Francisco on Christmas, you face the Dolphins at home, the Texans, who turned out to be a great team. You face them in week 1, but they ended up being a playoff team. So it ended up being a more difficult schedule than you could have imagined going into that season. And I feel like maybe this schedule could fall apart. A lot of these teams could fall off as contenders, but as it stands right now on paper, I just think it's difficult for them to repeat as division champs. And that's why, Jonas, I have them as a wild card team. I don't have them winning the division. I have the Cleveland Browns winning that division. I know I should never bet on Deshaun Watson, who is a bad player and a worse human being. I have them just improving enough offensively around Deshaun Watson. I think you get Nick Chubb hopefully back during the middle of the season for them. You have Amari Cooper already, who's quietly one of the best wide receivers in the NFL still. You add Jerry Jeudy. I just think that this is one of the best defenses again in the NFL. They kept a lot of guys. They have Jim Schwartz, who is one of the best coordinators in the NFL last year. I think they could come out on top in this AFC North.
Who do you have winning the Super Bowl?
We're jumping to that already. You know what? I was very tempted to have the Ravens making a miraculous Super Bowl run because I looked at the history and I said it's every 12 years that the Ravens win the Super Bowl, and it's going to be played in New Orleans. Certainly, everything is lining up for the Ravens to make a miraculous run. And then I look back at the offensive line group that is projected to start week 1 and had a hard time doing it. I think that the Niners should be back there. I don't know. I'd have to think about it, Jonas. I know that's a cop-out answer, but I had the Ravens making it as far as the divisional round and losing to the Buffalo Bills. I do not have the Ravens headed to New Orleans this year, but I do think I'm going to make one random wild prediction for this season. I do think the Ravens are going to get to the trade deadline and realize that they need to add. We saw them try to add Derrick Henry last year via trade, and ultimately they get him in free agency. I think they're going to make a splash this year on offense. I think they're going to go and get Devontae Adams from the Las Vegas Raiders. I think they want to add a number 1 wide receiver to that room. I think they're going to realize, all right, all this 12 personnel is nice, but it doesn't make up for a lack of a number 1 X wide receiver. They're going to get Devontae Adams into the building, and he is going to immediately click with Lamar Jackson. It's going to raise the ceiling of the offense, make up for the turnover on the offensive line, and they're going to make a charge to an 11-6 record, but they are going to come up short in the divisional round.
While you were talking, Paul, I thought of potential stakes. If either of us gets our Ravens midseason trade predictions right, and mine is them either getting Kendrick Bourne or Darius Slayton, if you want to throw another potential name in there. But okay. I was thinking, given our sporting proclivities, if I am right, then you have to watch a full soccer game completely sober with me. Oh. And if you're right, I have to watch like a full baseball game, which, by the way, is a little bit longer. So I'm really the hero here with you, completely sober.
Oh, that is wow. Does it have to be at like 5 a.m? Because that's when you have to wake up to watch like Manchester United play against.
If you're on, look at you dropping a little Man U knowledge. We can talk about it. My team is Liverpool, so we can find a time that would be amenable to you.
All right, and I'm gonna find the most boring September game possible. Actually, we can't do September because that's not until next year. An April game in the cold is when I'm going to find the time to force you to sit down and watch a game. I'm going to find the worst starter possible for the Orioles and tie you to a chair.
Yeah, at that point, I will have left the banner probably. All right. My prediction: I think the Ravens are winning the division. I think it'll be obviously a lot closer than last year's divisional race. I just, like I said, don't trust Joe Burrow's wrist. I don't trust the Bengals defense. The Steelers quarterback room, as evidenced by Russell friggin' Wilson being the week 1 starter, is just still a joke. The offensive line already a little bit shaky. They lost their projected starter. Broderick Jones was not looking all that great at right tackle. So, uh, I'm sure there's enough talent there for things to come together, but it's a little bit iffy right now. And then you mentioned the Browns equation of this. They should have a great defense, but Deshaun Watson, actively bad person, actively bad quarterback. Nick Chubb, who knows when he's going to come back, how he's going to look when he does come back. And can you expect David Njoku, Amari Cooper, these guys who were so awesome last year when Joe Flacco was their quarterback to recapture that form? I don't think we're going to get a Chiefs three-peat. I just think, as good as they are, I think they're pretty clearly the most talented team in the NFL. They obviously have the best player, probably have the best head coach. I just think that if we've learned anything from the annals of NFL history, it's that three-peats are really, really hard for a variety of reasons. So I think that the Ravens, even though they will not be the best team in the AFC during the regular season, I just feel like whether it's that every 12-year magic, whether it's just Lamar and Harbaugh finally getting the breakthrough that they've been due. They weren't good enough to beat the Titans in 2019, despite being the best team in the league. They weren't good enough to beat the Chiefs last year, despite being the best team in the league. I think that it would not surprise me, and I'm putting my name behind it right now, that they go on a magical run to the Super Bowl and then they lose to the Green Bay Packers, just because I am a sucker for Lamar narratives, and I just cannot wait to sink my teeth into what the blowhards on Sports Talk Radio and Sports Talk TV could possibly have to say after Lamar gets the Ravens to the Super Bowl, but does not actually win.
Or the blowhards like us on the Banner Ravens podcast as well. You asked for a Super Bowl prediction, Jonas. I'll give you a fun one. How about Bills against the Lions, and the Lions win their first Super Bowl? How about that? Wouldn't that be fun?
Is that just a you Korean favor with the upstate New York intelligentsia that you associated with at Syracuse?
I don't need to curry any favor with them. I think my 4 strong years at Syracuse University curried enough favor. All right, that just about does it for our marathon episode of the Banner Ravens podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in, and let us know how terrible our predictions are. Give us a like, a thumbs up, write us a good review. That would be very nice on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify, anywhere that you get your podcasts. You can also watch live on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Jonas, we will be back before week 1 of the regular season, before the Ravens go to Kansas City and Arrowhead to face off against Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs. Probably Monday or Tuesday, we'll have our Chiefs preview for you. And then Jonas is going to hop on a flight to KC. At Jonas_Shaffer is his Twitter handle. I'm at Paul Mancano. Jonas was literally breaking news via that Twitter handle earlier in the show. So, of course, if you don't follow him, you should be following him already. And subscribe to the BaltimoreBanner.com, where you can get all of Jonas's great work, and Gianna Hahn's great work, and Kyle Goon's great work for $1 for 6 months. For Jonas Shaffer, I'm Paul Mancano. Thanks so much for tuning in.